Hi there, everyone. My name's Scott Greeves. I'm a first-year PhD student in CCI. I'm in the School of Journalism and Electronic Media, and I'm really excited to be talking to you today as part of the CCI Research Symposium. I'm going to be talking about a project that or a study that I've been collaborating on with Dr. Oz, who is a professor in GEM here at UTK, and Dr. Shannon, who is a professor based out of a university in the Netherlands. The study is titled Facebook versus Twitter: How Social Media Affordances Influence Willingness to Express Opinions About Systematic Racism. Most people will be familiar, I think, with this theory, but this study uses the spiral of silence theory. And so the spiral of silence theory is a theory that was constructed in the 70s. And it states that an individual's perception on the distribution of public opinions will influence that individual's willingness to express their own opinions. And more specifically, it states that an individual will assess public opinion, or what's otherwise called the climate of opinion, or the opinion climate, and they will assess how consistent their own personal views are with that wider climate. If they perceive their views to be consistent with that climate, they're likely to share those views. They're going to be willing to express them. However, if they perceive that their views are in the minority viewpoint, i.e. not consistent with the climate of opinion, they're less likely to share those opinions. And the effect of that is that over time, more and more people share an opinion consistent with the existing opinion, and the minority opinion is actually suppressed even. And so what that does is it creates even more of an imbalance, more so than actually exists within the reality of public opinion, and it artificially inflates the majority opinion, and it artificially deflates or decreases the size of the minority opinion that is expressed. And this process is called the spiraling of silence. And basically one of the fundamental tenets of why this happens is because individuals fear they fear isolation. They fear social isolation. So if they share a view that's not consistent with the majority, they fear social sanctions in this context of isolation. So we're applying this framework to understand opinion expression within two distinct social media platforms, those two being Facebook and Twitter. And so we looked at it within the context of systematic racism as an important social issue, where people may wish to assess the climate of public opinion before they evaluate whether or not they want to express their views on those two distinct social media sites. So we used a web survey. We had 355 complete web surveys. The survey was investigating people's willingness to express their opinion on the two sites. All participants had to be active on both Facebook and Twitter. They had to have at least 50 friends or followers on each of the sites to participate. They had to be over 18. And we in this context, we wanted to investigate the affordances. So the affordances are the characteristics of the site that allow social actions. So we wanted to look at network association. So that's the ability for people to identify friends or friends of friends and other distal ties within the context of their friendship or follower base on those two sites, respectively. Similarly, we were also interested in social presence. So that was the degree to which people perceive each other as real in the mediated community. So do they see themselves as real people online, or instead are they acting under some sort of non-human avatar entity? And again, we're interested in anonymity, which refers to the perception of not being identifiable online. So that's similar to social presence, but slightly distinct in the definition that's given there. And so using those, glossing over some of the statistics here, but what we found, I find to be really, really interesting, was that fear of isolation we found to be associated with silencing on Facebook, but not on Twitter. So if you recall what I said about the spiral of silence, we expected fear of isolation, or if this the theory, the spiral of silence theory, is believed to be accurate across or applicable across all social media, we would have accepted it, or we would have expected that fear of isolation would have been associated with silencing on both Facebook and Twitter. But we did not find this to be the case. We found it to be the case on Facebook only, but not on Twitter. We found that on Twitter, anonymity was positively related with willingness to express opinion. So again, this possibly could be consistent with the spiral of silence, because individuals would fear less social sanctions because they feel that they themselves and others are more anonymous on Twitter. We did not find this to be the case on Facebook. We found that network association and social presence, as I just described them, those affordances intensified Facebook users' fear of isolation and strengthened the negative correlation between fear of isolation and willingness to express opinion on Facebook. And so these were really interesting findings. These were the core findings. That there were others, of course, but these core findings were very interesting, and we sought to explain them using network differences primarily. And what I mean by network differences is that there are key distinctions between Facebook and Twitter. So although in the literature, social media sites are often presented, even within the spiral of silence literature, social media sites are often described as one thing, but of course they're not. They're very distinct in their makeup, and the purpose of this paper is to suggest that the distinctions between social media sites could mean that they have different affordances, and those affordances might actually impact how some of the ideas, such as fear of isolation, as they relate to the spiral of silence theory, might have differences in people's opinion expression. And of course, that's what we found to be the case. So we thought a little bit more about these network differences, and we thought, well, perhaps our findings make sense in the context that Facebook, if you imagine your friend network on Facebook, those are very consistent with real world friendships. They have real world connections, and they're often reciprocal. So if you are friends with someone on Facebook, they are likely friends with, you have to have a connected network. It's a two-way thing. So therefore, the idea of social sanctions and fear of isolation amongst real world connections, people who you may actually see in real life, and you fear real world social sanctions from those individuals if you express an opinion outside of the majority, those are very real. However, on Twitter, most people construct their networks of followers not based off real world connections, not based off of reciprocal relationships, but rather based off of shared interests. And so this made sense also in the concept of anonymity, because individuals actually felt more anonymous online, not just because perhaps they were presenting less of an image of themselves, but also there was less of a social network to be considered. And so that made sense within the context of this second bullet point finding here. And equally, the third bullet point in the context of Facebook and the real world connections that I just discussed. And so really, because I realize I'm running out of time here, what this study does is it demonstrates that social media sites have distinct affordances that actually may and seem to, as this study suggests, affect how the application of the spiral of silence works on social media sites. And as such, there's clearly a need, as social media becomes much more prominent in global communication and interpersonal communication, it becomes clearly very important to understand how these individual affordances work and how they work to actually influence our willingness to express opinion on really important issues online. So clearly, future study needs to focus on not just Facebook and Twitter, but also emerging social media platforms such as Instagram, TikTok, just to name a few, and how those sites may have individual affordances as they relate to the Spiral of Silence framework, and discussing really important issues online. So thank you very much for listening to this very brief summary of this study, and hope to talk to some of you at the in-person conference. Thank you very much.